I have the great privilege and good fortune to be joined today by the two stars of Normal People, which I'm sure we've all seen at this point, Paul Mescal and Daisy Edgar-Jones. So nice to be here with all of you.
Thank
Hello.
you.
I wanted to preface this just by saying both of our shows managed to find audiences in a time of quarantine. And I wanted to just ask you both, why do you think it was that Normal People struck such a chord, particularly in this time?
Obviously, when our show aired, it was during a time where we were so acutely aware of a lack of human connection because we were all sort of stuck inside and we weren't able to socialize and be with our friends, which was so kind of different to anything we'd ever experienced. Because our show is so much about this connection between these two people over a few years, I feel that it perhaps resonated in a way more than it would have, because we were just watching it so aware of lacking that in our lives.
I totally agree, and I think it's really hard to kind of judge it in accordance to any other circumstance bar the fact that it was released in quarantine and in COVID. I just can't really imagine a world in which it came out in a normal setting. And I think also kind of the basic fact that everybody was sitting at home just as our show was being released. I think it is a show that requires an audience to really invest in the two characters, and the fact that they were able to sit with them for 6 hours in a row, I think really lends itself to the kind of way that I read the book, for example. You kind of just sit into it and you finish it. So
I mean, not to obviously, downplay the significance of all that you were talking about. I also think people were really horny. And I think the show really kind of offered something to a lot of people who were at home by themselves, a sort of voyeuristic experience and intimacy. But yes, everything else you said, of course, obviously very emotional. And we're going to get to all of that. But I do think there was a horny factor among a lot of people in their homes that were like, oh yeah, no, I can invest in this. This is very good. I mean, it obviously took two brilliant actors to make that resonate. And I think your performances in this show are so extraordinary. And I know that you've been asked sort of millions and millions of questions about chemistry. And I know that it's a tough thing to answer because there is no real answer to chemistry. It kind of just happens. But my question is, who got hired first?
I was hired first, and then
okay.
Yeah.
So Daisy, in terms of the audition process, did you know that Paul had been hired when you went into? Okay, so the pressure was on you.
Yes.
So how, as an actor, you go into a room knowing that someone has the job. It is almost up to you to go in and find instant chemistry with this person, knowing that you were going in for a chemistry read. So what was that audition like for you, knowing kind of what was at stake?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really kind of surreal day, and I don't most of it kind of passed in a blur. I was so terrified. I mean, I had fallen so deeply in love with this character and this story, having read the book, and I really had an idea of who I kind of wanted my Marianne to be from my self-tape and from having read the book. But I think you can only really have so much of an idea until you're in the room speaking those lines with somebody else. And that's really when you can formulate exactly your version of the character. And I think, I remember I saw Paul in the room because I accidentally walked into the room when he was discussing somebody else's audition. And I was like, oh my God, sorry. All of that. So I was so terrified. And I remember seeing him and being like, oh my gosh, that's Connell. And I kind of had this feeling of wow, he, because I'd read the book and I had a really sort of idea of who he was in my head. And Paul just I was like, oh my God, that's him. And I remember he was so nice. He came and was like, do you want to go for a chat before my audition? And really made me feel very comfortable. And I remember thinking, oh, he's a really nice person. So yeah, when I kind of stepped in the room, actually, both because of Paul and because of Lenny and Catherine and everyone and Louise, who was in the audition, they really created a really kind of safe space, thank goodness. So I sort of relaxed actually quite immediately. But it was really nice because we didn't do any of the preamble. I don't know if you know from auditioning loads, but whenever you go in and they're like, oh, how was your journey? And you're kind of like, trying
I'm
to be
fine.
yourself.
Please just let me do what I am here to do.
Yeah, you're like, oh, the weather's great, all of that stuff. We kind of went straight into playing the parts, and that's always what I like, because I'm not very good at being myself, but it was nice just to be able to relax into playing somebody else. And I just kind of really felt immediately that I was able to play my version of Marianne with Paul, and it didn't feel like I had to change anything massively. It just felt like it kind of accentuated, and elevated, I guess, for me, my version of her, because he was so incredible. And so I just really enjoyed the audition, actually, in the end. And then when I left, I was like, oh my gosh, I completely forgot everything that happened. But so it was actually quite a positive experience.
I find that as someone who is, on my show, I was acting, but I was also casting simultaneously. It is something that is really extraordinary, the casting process. And, as actors out there who don't get parts, and I'm terrible at auditioning and have lost many a job because of it, you do realize, though, that there are moments in your career where something comes across your desk that is so in line with who you are, and so in line with your instincts, and so in line with your impulses, that it almost kind of fits like a glove in a way that you don't have to try. And watching the two of you in this show, it was just a perfect example of the joy that a director or a producer must have experienced when you both came together. You both have come a very long way in a year. Your lives have changed. You have become very famous very quick. There's been a lot of success. And it's been a strange thing because so many people are in their homes. So you've experienced this kind of personal shift that is so monumental and so life-changing. Was there a moment when you kind of looked at each other and knew that you were in for something really special or life-changing?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think, Paul?
Yeah.
I think that moment when we watched the first 2 episodes together.
Yeah, just before we went to Italy, that was the last 2 weeks of the shoot. Lenny took us in because of the nudity in the show. We were able to kind of say yes and no to things. But ultimately, it was me and Daisy going in to watch episode 1 and 2. So we were like, I remember being petrified, and we sat down beside each other, and Nathan, the editor, was there, and Lenny was here, and me and Daisy were. I remember literally being inside my jumper watching it. And I remember watching it, and we sat in a taxi on the way home. And I think me and Daisy would be the greatest critics of ourselves. But I remember us sitting there being like, I think this is, if nothing else, has captured the spirit of the book, which we both of us and everybody else working on it loved. And I think if we'd gone in and said, right, if you watch episode 1 and 2 and you feel like you've captured the spirit of the book from our own perspectives, we'd be doing a good job. And I remember sitting there being like, oh my God, this could be what we set out to make. And I know from talking to people, that's not always the case, but I think we were very lucky that we had that kind of lift going into the final 2 weeks.
Yeah, those moments are so special. Those moments when you kind of look across. I know that I had it with Annie on our show on our first day of shooting. Not that I thought that it was going to be a success, but we kind of looked at each other, and there's this moment that we both remember, which was kind of looking across at each other. We were both terrified, but we knew that we were starting something. And I wanted to talk from an acting perspective. What was the hardest arc within the series that you felt for your character?
Yeah, I definitely found the latter part, the latter block and the latter kind of 6 episodes, particularly with Marianne's kind of mental health, quite tricky, because it's a very subtle shift that kind of slowly begins, and it's not very obviously at first, and it's all quite nuanced. But I think because obviously we weren't filming in order, it was quite tricky always to plot exactly where she was. So I found that quite tricky, and I think definitely episode 9 in Sweden, because so much of what she's feeling when you read the book is such a kind of numbness and a vacancy. When you're playing something, you have to portray something, to the audience, or you have to. So I think to actively play an emptiness was quite an interesting thing to work out how to do.
Yeah, it's similarly the second half of it, and I think there was like kind of a lot of factors that went into that, because I think in the first 6 episodes, both myself and Daisy spent a huge amount of time together on set, and then suddenly we went into the second block, and it was just disconnected because we were off on our own private little storylines, and also to kind of hark back to what Daisy said in terms of, at that point you have a really good understanding about who Connell and Marianne are. So when Connell's sitting down with the therapist, and you want to protect him from what you know is coming up in the scene, but you know that it's a huge moment for him as a character to kind of step out and ask for help, but you know that it doesn't really fit with his kind of inherent personality traits. So you know that there's going to be a big cost in having a conversation like that. And also kind of the pressure that I think a lot of actors feel when you first get a set of scripts and you go, okay, I know that this scene is a biggie, you know, and you try to put that to the back of your head, and then you see it coming on the call sheet and you're like, okay, it's today, it's tomorrow, so I found that difficult. But again, you kind of just try and do as much preparation as possible, and then you just listen to the other actors and the director, and then it was quite a relief getting to, especially the episode 12 stuff with Daisy, when they're kind of in, I think, a very healthy place in their like early 20s where they're really communicating and actively listening to each other. And then of course what happens.
As an audience member, you could feel every heartbeat that existed between the two of them. And I think that's, again, not to just like constantly compliment the work that you were doing, but as actors, it must have been in a way, kind of such a relief to know that those moments and the chemistry and the experiences and the journey that you took, and how difficult it can be to block shoot. Because I think a lot of people don't understand, if they haven't done the block shooting, which happens a lot in television, that you are really, I mean, we block shot all the time, and suddenly you have a very emotional moment kind of, and then having to follow that with something that is totally different, and then going back into something. So I had all these grids when we were shooting our show of like, where am I now in the trajectory of this? And how am I? But it must have just felt great. And I know that like emotional scenes are always hard to do. And I think just obviously, tears are a hard thing to kind of, some people it's very easy. I remember in the first season trying to cry, and it was like the most painful, awful experience that just, we ended up not even using that take because it was just, but, in terms of accessing that, do you think it was just a connection that you had between the character? I think a lot of kind of people wonder about tears in television. And is it something that really comes with an understanding and an empathy with the character? It's not something I think that the human body can just manufacture quite easily.
I think they're just terrifying scenes to look at, because I think it comes down to the person. Like in my daily life, I don't cry from 10 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening. Right. And I think we were lucky to a certain extent with when those scenes, and they're not necessarily scenes where there's crying involved, but they're scenes where there's a real emotional lift to it. I think they were kind of placed towards the end of the blocks for the most part. Yeah, I think it's as you said, the closer you get to the character, the easier it is to kind of step into the emotional place that they are in at the time.
We were so lucky as well with the script that we were given, and also the length of the scenes. A lot of the time, like I hadn't really done anything that had, sometimes we were doing like 5, 6, 7 page scenes. In episode 11, we filmed that whole massive scene on the bed, and we ended up doing like 15-minute takes. And, when you're actually able to, in real time, play a kind of a conversation that begins one way and ends in a different way, which is so much closer as well to how, how we never expect to cry. I never expect to cry. The things that make me cry, I never expect to happen. And it's
always weird when it's written into a script, like they begin to cry and you're like,
yes,
no,
completely. Tears stream down her face. She's emotional. it's tricky.
A single tear falls gently down her cheek. Oh, thanks. I'll work on that.
Best of luck with that.
Yeah. It's tricky. And I think like there's a scene that is one of my favorites in episode 5 where they're having a conversation about and Connell apologizes to Marianne for the way that he treated her in school. And I remember just loving it because the conversation it was never expected it was going to go that way. It just began about, she talks about how he must be loving being top of the class. And suddenly they go into this really honest apology that is so unexpected and so kind of raw. And I think that's really interesting because, yeah, those conversations, you don't always expect to have them. They come out of nowhere. And those are the things that kind of catch you off guard and make you emotional. And we were very lucky being able to, first of all, having such beautiful dialogue to play with, but also actually being allowed to play out that emotion in real time. So it was easier to access by the end of the scenes.
There are so many kind of very volatile relationships that the group of you as friends and as actors had to go through. And I was recently once, like a couple weeks ago, asked about one of the great TV villains of quarantine. And my answer was Marianne's brother. It was so cold and it was so mean. And the way that he treated her, I mean, your relationship, I think, even just as actors, was so vivid and so lived in that watching it at times felt so uncomfortable because there was such an intimacy that you both were able to bring out in terms of the chemistry that you had as siblings. What was that experience like for you, working with that actor and kind of finding that relationship?
Frank Blake, who played Alan, I think he's just incredible, the loveliest person ever. Like, such a laugh. So like we had a completely opposite relationship, and like he is so amazing because he is so different, obviously, to Alan. And I mean, I think it was really interesting, and I really, same with Aisling McGuckin, who played Denise, Marianne's mum. I think there's a very interesting unspoken dynamic between the three of them, and it's never really dived into too deeply. It's very kind of subtle, but I think the way that they play it, you really have a sense of such a huge amount of scar tissue that they're living with, and such a huge amount of history. And that's something, I mean, I remember Lenny saying, we discussed at length the dynamic between Denise, Alan and Marianne, and potentially about, they obviously had a father who was abusive, and whether perhaps Denise feels guilty because Alan was that bit older and perhaps witnessed more than Marianne had, or perhaps was physically abused himself, whereas Marianne wasn't, stuff like that. There was a whole kind of backstory that we talked about to really understand why they act the way they do. But just, going into those scenes with Frank and the way he could kind of bring that menace and that coldness, but also played in such a human way. And you realize that it's coming from such a deep level of insecurity and a deep damage that he is living with. I just think I'm in awe of him, really.
The end of the series is obviously kind of, it's one of those things where you respect it. You obviously want to know that everything's going to be okay. In your personal opinions, and maybe you have insight that I do not have, but what do you think becomes of these two people after the end of the show?
I remember it would depend on, like, me and Daisy would kind of have conversations throughout the shooting process of being like, oh, what do you think happens at the end? And would always be kind of related to the scenes that we'd be shooting at the time. Like, if they were in a difficult part of their relationship, we'd kind of just be like, look, they're just going to go their separate ways, or vice versa. Like, towards the end, it's like they're guaranteed to be together. And I think that what I find satisfying about that, even though it is vague, I think it's what Sally has captured so well, in that a relationship doesn't have to be long lasting to be successful. Like, we are kind of conditioned in a certain sense to kind of want characters that we love on screen to like be together in a kind of hypothetical future of these characters. But I think that the care and love that they have for each other is more important. That's what I
do really ultimately want them to be together forever and live happily ever after. And I think, in one universe they do, but I do also think that actually what Sally's really kind of done so well is show how much one person can change another, and how important the relationships we have in those early stages of our life fundamentally make us the human beings we are.
I mean, it is quite true of as someone who is much older, there is your 20s are like an incredibly kind of intense time. And it's amazing how much happens in that decade, and how much sort of significant relationships come and go, and they
Yeah.
all make you almost prepare you for your 30s. So, you know, watching it, there was this, I think that's why I asked, because you kind of hope that things will work out the way that you want them to as a viewer. And yet at the same time, someone who, you know, as someone who has gone through my 20s, you realize that that's not how that works. And that you ultimately are who you are because of the people who came and went in your life. And everyone kind of serves that purpose in a very formative and substantial way. I feel like every job teaches you something that makes you better at what you do. What do you think you took away or learned as actors from this experience that you will kind of carry with you into your future projects?
You can have a lot of fun. You don't have to, you know, obviously take things seriously, but, you know, like I heard a saying recently, which was like, take it seriously, but wear it lightly. And I think that show was a real example of that, because yeah, that's something I've really learned, that hopefully in my next jobs, I'll take it seriously and I'll work really hard, but I'll try and enjoy it as well, because it, you know, that you can actually do both of those things.
And hopefully an egoless one. I think that was my big takeaway, was like, if you strip the ego out of a creative environment, you give people a kind of freedom that often doesn't exist on movie sets, because someone is setting a kind of hierarchical system that ultimately makes people feel like they don't want to expose every part of themselves. So it was very clear on Normal People that this is a shout out to the entire team of just how that group made everything work, from the directing to the you know, the photography to the support players and ultimately to you. So congratulations on everything. Thank you for making a month of my quarantine feel so kind of oddly joyful. It was incredibly devastating, but oddly joyful. And I wish you both the best and hope that we can kind of run into each other in person in the next 5 to 10 years. So congratulations, and thank you for letting me ask you some questions today.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
So nice
Thank
to
you.
speak to you.